Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Hello and welcome to the London part of the show. I'm Jo Coburn. Joining me for the duration, Tulip Siddiq, Labour MP for Hampstead and Kilburn, and the Conservative MP for Spelthorne, Kwasi Kwarteng. Welcome to both of you. Hi. I want to start with Ken Livingstone's decision to resign from the Labour Party. The former London mayor has been suspended since 2016 over allegations of anti-Semitism, following comments he made about Hitler and Zionism. Tulip, was it right that Ken Livingstone decided that he would go rather than the party actually deciding to kick him out?
I think this has been a really sad episode for the Labour Party. A former mayor, I grew up here in my early 20s. He was a very good mayor of London. He reacted very well with the 7/7 attacks and he rejuvenated the transport system. And why he would do this to his legacy is beyond me. But what I would say is that I've been calling for his expulsion for 2 years now because of all the hurt and the offence he's caused to the Jewish community, particularly in my constituency, but generally to friends of the Jewish community as well.
But was justice served that he went on his own terms?
I would have preferred that we had expelled him, and I've been very clear on that. I think we dragged our feet in the process, and I really hope moving forward that we don't take this long to make a decision, because there's no doubt in my mind that he should have been expelled a long time ago.
Do you think it speaks to a wider problem of attitudes within the Labour Party at the very top?
I think there are elements of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. There's no doubt about that. What I take issue with is saying that the whole of the Labour Party is anti-Semitic. You know, there are people like me who are friends of the Jewish community who've stuck my neck out to try and speak up and support the Jewish community. There are certainly elements. I'm not naive in terms of denying that there's problems in the Labour Party, as there are in lots of parties, and I think we should take swift action when something like this comes to light.
So you think it took too long and you think the party should have done something about it, but do you think there are people in the leader's office, for example, who perhaps in some way delayed or didn't act quickly enough on this?
Look, I don't know whether it was the leader's office, but what I will say to you, that as someone who's part of the Labour Party and has been for a long time, the rules have got to be the same for everyone. Just because you're a former mayor, because you're powerful, because you're an older man...
And you're a friend of the Labour leader.
You should not have different rules applied to you. You should be expelled if you've upset and insulted certain communities like Ken did.
I mean, Tulip has talked about the problems of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. It's not just the Labour Party, of course. There are problems of racism in every political party. How did you feel when Rosie Carroll, who was a Tory councillor, former mayor of Pendle, suspended a year or so ago for a Facebook post when she compared an Asian person to a dog and was allowed back in the party just before the local elections this year?
Look, I think what she did was completely reprehensible. I don't know actually about the details of that specific local party.
Well, those are the details.
It's in Pendle, which is in, I'm not even sure which county it's in. I think it's in Lancashire. But let's not divert from the actual question of anti-Semitism. That was a huge issue here in London, in the capital, in the local elections. You only had to look at the results in Barnet with very, very high turnouts, where a large number of Jewish voters were simply appalled and repulsed by anti-Semitism in Jeremy Corbyn's Labour.
But are there double standards? That's what I'm saying. If we're looking broadly at issues of racism, should Rosie Carroll have been allowed in by the local party, and should the central Conservative Party have challenged that decision?
I think the chairman has condemned in no uncertain terms what she said, but that was a local party. I don't know the details. The difference with this Ken Livingstone case, as Tulip said, is that he's an extremely high-profile Labour politician. There is a suspicion that people around the leader, around Jeremy Corbyn, have similar views, and this was reflected in the ballot box a few weeks ago.
What do you say to Kwasi saying that people in the leader's office have similar views?
I reject that. What I would say is that in my party, I want to have a zero tolerance. Whether it's anti-Semitism, whether it's racism, whether it's misogyny, I would like to have a zero tolerance to that, and we should be expelling members and not looking at what kind of status they hold in the party. They have no place in my Labour Party.
And you made an accusation there about people in the leader's office. Who are you thinking of specifically?
I'm not sure. I'm not going to...
Should you be making those sorts of
claims? What I'm going to
claims?
say is that Ken Livingstone and Jeremy Corbyn have been associates for 40 years, decades. There are lots of people around them who've shared their offices, who've been involved in campaigns for a very long time.
But it doesn't mean that they hold views which are anti-Semitic.
It doesn't necessarily mean that, but there is a suspicion. There is a suspicion that they do share those views.
Could I come in with something? In 2010, when Ken Livingstone came and campaigned for the independent candidate over the Labour candidate in the Tower Hamlets mayoral election, I called for his expulsion. Jeremy Corbyn was not leader then, no one thought he would ever become leader, and he was still allowed to get away with it. This is about double standards, and diverting it and making it about the leader is not helpful. We have to make sure we expel these elements, which are very corrosive in the Labour Party, and I've been very firm about that.
All right, you've been very clear. There was a lot of attention on Russia this week. A damning report from the Foreign Affairs Committee accused the government of turning a blind eye to dubious Russians who bring their money to London. There are now new laws in place to combat that, but will they be enforced? Tanjil Rashid has this.
High society has been flocking to the new Chelsea Flower Show. What they probably don't know is that one of its gardens is sponsored by VTB Capital, a Russian financial institution whose sister organisation VTB Bank is under sanctions. Around the corner, the local football club is of course owned by the Russian tycoon Roman Abramovich. He's facing difficulties getting back into town after his investor visa ran out. The government is not commenting on the case, but there's speculation the authorities are getting curious about how this friend of President Putin got so wealthy.
There's no doubt a lot of money has come from Russia and ended up in parts of London like this. It hasn't just supported the flower show and the football club, but also the property market around here. But where has all that cash come from? A good deal of it, according to the damning judgment of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, is dirty money. And they single out London as the laundromat that cleans all that cash and turns it into seemingly legitimate investments.
What we want is greater transparency, complete revealing of who are the owners of properties, of investments and companies. We also want greater enforcement.
But that enforcement has been pretty lax in London, according to some observers.
There are a few places that can rival it. It's only New York, really. And if you go to New York with dirty money, they probably put you in prison. So frankly, it's better to come here. London is a favoured destination for laundering Russian money. Dirty money from anywhere, but particularly Russian money. If you own money with a taint on it, it's dirty, it's been illegally acquired. Our best professionals, our lawyers, our accountants, our estate agents are able to strip the taint away from that by hiding it in offshore and then investing it in a lovely asset, this house, that car.
The government's response is the new Sanctions and Anti-Money Laundering Act, which has just received royal assent.
That includes the so-called Magnitsky Amendment, which allows the authorities to freeze the assets of individuals connected to human rights abuses and to deny them entry. The lack of those powers had made London a more attractive, or certainly an easier destination for certain types of people. But laws are only worthwhile if they're actually enforced. And experts say the City of London Police and other bodies simply don't have the resources to outwit the professional money launderers in their midst.
The Kremlin say this is all part of an economic war. At the same time, the Russian embassy has been gloating that the government's efforts will amount to nothing. In a statement, they also accused the UK of a blatant anti-Russian policy. And that's what London's Russian community, said to be at least 50,000 strong, is worried about.
The whole situation seems unfair. We don't want to be asked questions like how you earn this money. We already explain every time we apply for visa. But of course we have a small percentage of people who are extremely rich, and people just love to talk about them much more because it's more exciting.
The Anti-Corruption Foundation estimates £100 billion has come here from Russia over the last 20 years, only some of which will have been laundered. Whether London will continue to remain a desirable destination for Russian money will hinge on how tough the authorities act with the powers now under their belt.
Tanjil Rashid reporting. I'm joined by Tom Keating, who is Director of the Centre for Financial Crime and Security Studies at the Royal United Services Institute. Welcome to the programme. Tom, do you agree with the Foreign Affairs Committee that actually it's still business as usual when it comes to dealing with Russia?
Well, I gave evidence to that committee, and that's one of the things that I said, so I agree absolutely. I don't think we've tightened the noose in the way that perhaps rhetoric would suggest we should be. What should have been done? I think it's important to bear in mind that for 20-25 years we've had the welcome mat out to this kind of money. We have chosen to welcome that money to the UK rather than it going elsewhere. So we are facing a decades-long legacy which the current government is trying to grapple with things like unexplained wealth orders to ask these people to explain where their money comes from. We're not going to solve this overnight.
Right. I mean, Kwasi, it's true, isn't it, that actually when relations were better with Russia, we didn't really care about the source of that money, whether it was dirty money or not?
I don't think that it's been politically driven. I think what Tom said is true. I think for 25, 30 years, governments of whatever stripe have welcomed this money. But now, as you pointed out, Tom, the government is trying to deal with it. I don't think it's got anything to do with Salisbury or any of the other things that have happened in the recent months.
Well, that's when all the activity seemed to occur in terms of the government response. That's when we heard a lot of the rhetoric about trying to clamp down.
In your piece, they referred to the so-called Magnitsky provision, and I saw Bill Browder at the time that was going through the House. That was long before any of the events in Salisbury. In fact, it was last year.
Right, but in fact
it was debated. So to say that the Salisbury attack has sort of precipitated government action, I think.
Well, let's say galvanised government action. I mean, what do you think?
I think we have to go back to 2016, the anti-corruption summit of David Cameron. So David Cameron made his speech in Singapore about, the UK should not be the place that people come to stash their dodgy cash, and that, in a way, led to the criminal finances bill, unexplained wealth orders. So I'd say the government has been moving forward, but as was importantly made clear in that film, it's about resources, it's about investing in our capability to respond, and that we are not doing.
Why do you think successive governments have found it difficult to take tough action on this?
I think you are right that successive governments have ignored this or dragged their feet on it. But I think what's important is that at least it's finally come to light, because as a London MP, I don't want this city to become a place where dirty money is laundered. And one of the things that I'm most worried about is that the properties, which are anonymous or no one knows who owns them, 44% of those properties are actually in the capital. And believe it or not, they're called secret neighbourhoods. And Camden, which is in my constituency, is the third biggest secret neighbourhood, where there are 2,000 homes and no one knows who owns them. So I really back this call for a public register which has accountability. We must have accountability of who owns properties.
I think before we pass any more laws, I think we need to look at enforcement. I think Tom's point was very good. I think the report, as far as I looked at it, suggested that we were actually falling behind in terms of enforcing the existing law.
Why is that?
And that's what we should be doing. Well, there are lots of reasons why that might be the case, but I think the fact is we've got the law, we've got the right laws, and we need to enforce them.
Do you agree that the laws are in place, they're just not being enforced?
The laws are in place. I think the one thing Pig Campbell and Tulip said is that we cannot wait for this register of offshore-owned properties. So that we simply cannot wait for 3 years, which the government is suggesting, and that is feet-dragging.
Right. I mean, when it comes to Roman Abramovich, for example, his visa's been held up. Is that right? Do you support that?
Look, Joe, I have no idea about the individual nature of that case. I have no idea what information the Home Office or otherwise might have.
Well, it was part of the government's rhetoric, wasn't it, to be tough on knowing the sources of people's money?
You really ought to ask politicians about individual cases.
Why not?
In that way, because I am not privy to the individual facts. I'm not privy to the case, and I would be probably prejudicing the case or talking out of complete ignorance.
I don't think it stops us asking the question, and you're entitled to say...
He's an individual citizen. I have no idea why his visa was withheld.
Right, but, I mean, what do you think in terms of certain Russian individuals finding it more difficult to get back into the country?
Well, the government has committed to look more closely at the source of funds that come with investor visas. The investor visa scheme was flawed until 2015. It's now been tightened up. So anyone who is renewing their visa today that was provided to them before 2015 can expect to be looked at much more closely than they were previously.
I think what Tom said is right. It's good that we're tightening up.
That's what I was asking.
We're tightening up what happened before. There's no doubt that, as you say, in the last 3 years, we have tightened up the regime. We're looking at dirty money. We're trying to sort these problems out. But as Tom said, it's a legacy issue. It's happened over the last 25 years.
Right.
Been exposed to this kind of money.
Yes, but these are the questions that people will want to know. On the basis of what is the government taking this action? I mean, in your mind, Tulip, is it in our interest to do this? I mean, billions of pounds have come in from Russian investors that support schools, public schools, banks, universities. Are we at risk of losing that?
I don't think we should be marginalising one society, that's for sure. And in the video, it was very clear that this lady was talking about how they don't want to feel targeted. But if you're asking me if we should be strict on people who may be indulging in corruption, tax evasion, maybe potential terrorism, yes, of course we should be strengthening the law. And I think the government should step up and do something about it and not drag their feet.
But to slightly redress the balance, we have to accept that in this country we are a rule of law country. You can't simply take things off people you don't like the look of. And there is a legal process. So I know that there are problems with dirty money, but we shouldn't go the other way and try and confiscate everything inside.
I think that's an important point. It's a point that the Foreign Secretary made to the Foreign Affairs Committee. My response to that would be absolutely we should not be directing law enforcement to pick on certain people, but we should be giving law enforcement the resources to do the job that they want to do, and that we're not.
But that's a separate point from the
Well, I'll answer the question on
Abramovich or any individual.
But he's an example of somebody who's been caught up, which is why your defensiveness, slightly, if you don't mind me saying, on it is slightly disingenuous, I felt.
Well, I simply don't know the nature of it.
No, well, fine, and you've said that. But in terms of resources, then, that Tom is talking about, do you accept that there aren't enough resources for people to investigate these things in the way you'd like to? I
think that the law, such as it is, should be enforced better. Now, if that's a question of resources, then we should look into that, absolutely. But there's no doubt that the existing laws, I think, are satisfactory for this, and we should be enforcing them. Right.
I mean, should the Treasury follow the lead that's set in America? I mean, they do seem to be tougher on these sorts of issues, on financial crime, money laundering. Would that be the direction you'd like to see follow?
I'd like to see the existing law enforced. I mean, if you look at where we are in terms of a rule of law state, the reason why London is particularly attractive to people from all over the world is because of the whole issue of the rule of law. There are property rights, there is a judicial process, and I wouldn't want to see anything that attacked that or undermined it.
So in December last year, the then Home Secretary Amber Rudd used that phrase, hostile environment, to refer to the attitude the UK should have to bribery, corruption and money laundering. It's not a hostile environment. I don't think you feel under threat if you're wanting to launder corrupt money through the UK these days.
But Tulip, you said you don't want to focus on one community. I mean, should we be looking at some Saudis, Qataris or Chinese who are investing here? Should we also be looking at the sources of the money coming from them?
Yes, I do think we should. And I think that there is a need for transparency in our system, and there is a need to look at the capital and see where the dirty money is coming from. And I would be in favour of strengthening the law. I agree that there is existing legislation which needs to be applied properly. But if I just go back to this public register which I spoke about, which Sadiq Khan wrote to the Business Secretary last year and said, I am in support of this, of exposing who owns each property, it's now going to be 5 years before that's implemented. Why do we need 5 years for that?
Should it be brought in sooner?
Well, Tulip made the point very well. We've got to enforce the existing law. Now, if the existing law isn't being enforced well, I don't see the point of bringing in new laws.
Is the Treasury reluctant to over-regulate the city?
I think that the city is a great British success story. So anything that we do that could impede or damage it is something that we would resist doing.
Tom, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now, on Monday, 11 months after a blaze tore through Grenfell Tower in West London, an inquiry into why and how it could have happened opened. But new revelations uncovered by the BBC have raised more questions than answers. Sebastian Ash has more.
In its opening week, the Grenfell Tower inquiry heard the tributes of grieving family members and friends.
Look at what happens when there's a flame. The cladding core melts.
And now an investigation by the BBC's Panorama programme has revealed that the insulation on the tower never passed the required safety test and should never have been used. It claims that insulation manufacturer Celotex used extra fire retardant in the sample they tested, but not that which they sold to clients and which was used on the tower. Celotex refused to comment while the inquiry was still ongoing. Panorama was advised that Celotex's actions could constitute corporate manslaughter. It will be for the inquiry chairman, Sir Martin Morbick, to recommend if charges should be pursued. Then on Wednesday at Prime Minister's Questions, Theresa May addressed the issue of cladding on high-rise buildings.
Dame Judith Hackett's recommendations did not include recommending the banning of inflammable cladding. We are minded to go further by banning combustible materials in cladding on high-rise buildings. We are meeting our legal duty to consult on these proposals, and we will not delay any necessary action.
The inquiry will continue to look at what happened on that fateful night, before in 6 months' time moving on to examine evidence looking at why it happened.
Sebastian Ash reporting there. Kwasi, Theresa May said, and obviously looked at this issue of banning cladding, and now they're going to wait, I think, for the consultation report to finish. Why not just ban it anyway?
Look, I think the consultation is really important, but the fact is we've got a new Secretary of State. James Brokenshire said this is right at the top of his agenda, and I think it's only right. I think the consultation ends at the end of July, and it makes a lot of sense to ask people, what do you think went wrong? What do you think we can do to improve the system? And then once the consultation is in, we can start making proper decisions.
Is that the right way to go?
I would be in favour of a consultation if we actually listen to people. And I say that because this tragedy and the building that we just saw could have been avoided if people had been listened to in the first place. I met the survivors of Grenfell at the Speaker's House quite recently, and Kwasi and I were both in a debate recently about Grenfell where a lot of the survivors were there. And the thing that keeps haunting me is that they keep saying to me, these are things we've been saying for years and years, and our voices were never heard. In the consultation, if people's voices are actually heard, then I'm all for a consultation, but I just don't want it to be some kind of wash where no one's voices actually get heard.
I couldn't agree with that more. I think that if you're going to have a consultation, if any government has a consultation, they have to actually listen to the people who are giving their advice. And so to hear of people warning and being ignored is really heartbreaking, because their information, their knowledge, their expertise should have been listened to.
I mean, is there a broader problem that politicians just don't listen to certain groups of people because they don't think their voice is merited?
Well, I said in the debate, and it's for public record, that there was an issue in this particular area in terms of the fact, because I've been going there for 30 years more, and there is a perception that people who are more vulnerable aren't being listened to. Now, that might not be true, but that is a perception, and the government, any government, has to deal with that.
When we sat in Westminster Hall and we listened to the list of names being read out of people who had died in the tragic accident, it really struck me how many of those names were, first of all, of ethnic origin, but also everyone you spoke to said, when I spoke to the survivors, we're working class, we live in tower blocks, our voices aren't heard. And there is, I think, a huge question here about why their voices weren't heard, because they're from a particular class, maybe from a particular background, the poverty levels. So that's why I really feel that if we're going to do this, we have to do it right, and the inquiry has got to be right. We've got to allow the legal representatives of the survivors to cross-examine the witnesses, see the evidence from top to bottom. There's a lot of suspicion about the inquiry at the moment, and I think we need to address that.
But also, people will want answers relatively quickly. They won't want the inquiry to drag on and on. Do you accept that?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's something that's got to be done. We're reaching the one-year anniversary quite soon, and the people I spoke to feel like they can't move on with their lives because of what they experience, but also the fact that a lot of them are still in temporary accommodation. It's the least we owe these people, after what they've been through, to house them and give them a permanent home.
Right, I mean, the housing is obviously a big issue for the victims and victims' families of Grenfell. Should that now be fast-tracked?
I think that the vast majority of people have been rehoused. There are still a few cases, I accept, of people who haven't been rehoused, but the vast majority have been. I think the Prime Minister was very generous with the £400 million in terms of paying for the recladding. And I also feel that what Tulip said is right. I think people have felt that they're not being listened to because of their background. Right. And there is a problem in that particular borough with widening inequality. As I said, I remember it from the 80s. And it was a slightly different, atmosphere.
We're going to have to leave it there because that's all we have time for. But my thanks to both of you.